This is the third video in the series of videos critiquing the sample research prospectus that I wrote for you, so I'm just going to pick back up where I left off. In the previous video, I was discussing how important it is to explain or justify research decisions that your reader may question or that seem relevant for you to offer a little bit more of a rationale for. And in this case, what I had done was I had explained why I had chosen the University of Mississippi's Student Food Bank as the food bank to collect data for the small-scale project, and that's what I was doing in this sentence here. So continuing on, I explain not only the site that I would use for my data collection, but here in this sentence I also indicate what exactly it is I would want to do for the small-scale project. So I'm proposing a multi-method approach, as I've indicated here, and that would include semi-structured interviews with staff affiliated with the food bank, and then also surveys of food bank clients. So I'm telling my reader exactly what my methods would be, and remember that if you are planning to do an interview for the small scale and or the large scale, you do want to specify what kind of interview that would be. So remember that in previous materials I had given you reviewing research methods, I had told you that there are really three different forms of an interview that you would propose for your research. So you may propose a structured interview, which is where you would have a script prepared beforehand and you wouldn't deviate from that script at all during the interview. So you would ask the questions as they were written in the order they were written, and regardless of what your participant told you during the interview, you wouldn't branch off from that. You would really just stick to the script. Another option is the semi-structured interview, which is what I've indicated I would use for my research. And the semi-structured interview means that you would have a script prepared beforehand for the interview, but that during the interview you would allow yourself to deviate from that script as relevant. So if you had asked a question from your script and then the participant gave you a really interesting answer and there was something that that person had said that you would want to get some more information about that the questions in your script really wouldn't allow you to do, then you could follow up on what the interviewee had said and you would be deviating from the script. The other option for an interview would be the open interview, so an interview where you had no script prepared beforehand. Now this doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a purpose and you would just kind of go into the interview to see what happens. You would still have your research question, you would still know the kinds of things that you would be interested in learning about, but it's just that you wouldn't have any kind of script prepared beforehand. It would really be more just like a natural conversation. So those are really three clear-cut options for you in terms of an interview. And again, you would want to specify if you are intending to propose an interview, whether for the small scale and or the large scale studies, you would want to indicate what kind of interview it is you would be proposing to do. And then similarly, if you're saying that you would want to do observations to collect data, you want to specify what role would you take. Would you be a passive observer or a non-participant observer, which is where you would be observing really from a distance. You wouldn't be interacting with the people in that site that you're observing. Or would you be a participant observer where you would actually engage with members of that culture or group that you were observing? So again, you do need to be really specific and detailed when you're describing your research methods. You don't want to leave anything unclear for the reader so that he or she has to guess what your research would entail, especially given the purpose of this assignment, which is to persuade your audience to fund your proposal. So if you're not detailed and specific, there's no way that a group would fund this proposal. They want to know exactly what it is you would do, why it is you would do what you're saying you would do, and what the benefit is of that proposed research. Now, I go on to explain the value of why I would choose to do this multi-method approach. That's what I'm doing here in this sentence. And then also I go on and explain, again, some further justification and what the potential value would be. And also, as I've indicated here, I do also give my hypothesis or what I anticipate I would find. I just say really simply that I would expect my findings to reflect what the research that's been previously published has shown. So you do need to identify what it is you would expect to find through your research, but how detailed you get really depends on your specific project. So in my case, I didn't really linger on that. I certainly could have strengthened this maybe by saying I would expect my findings to be XYZ, which are comparable or similar to the findings of previous studies, but I just didn't do that here. So continuing on, this paragraph, what it does is it talks about the institutional review board training and paperwork that would be required if you are proposing to do research involving human participants. And this isn't something that we really discussed or focused on, in part because you're not actually collecting data in this summer session. If you were, then we definitely would have addressed this and I would have shown you the paperwork. So basically, anytime you are conducting research where people are involved, and the same would apply if you were conducting research involving animals, but given your majors, the kind of research you would be likely to do in the future would be human subject research. So if you're ever conducting a study where you are collecting your data from other people, you have to go through the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. The IRB's goal is really just to ensure that no harm comes to participants, that you are upholding research ethics, and really the IRB is a necessary part of any institution, because this is common at any major university. They'll have an IRB. This is really important just to ensure that research really is ethical. If you look back in history, we have lots of examples where research was done unethically. Even going back to Tuskegee, for example, if you read up on that, to give you an example that's a little bit more local, there are certainly cases where researchers have done really some horrendous things in the name of trying to discover something. And so we have these protocols in place to try and ensure that things like that don't happen going forward. So whenever you are, again, proposing a project involving human subjects for data collection, you would go through the IRB. Now, with IRB, you have a few different options of what the paperwork looks like for that. So if you're doing a class project and it meets certain criteria, you could file a class project waiver application, which basically, if your project met all the criteria, means that it would be considered exempt. In other cases, though, especially for what I'm proposing here, because I'm not identifying this as a class project, and given the sensitive nature of what I would be investigating, in other cases, you do need to complete the full IRB application, where you really can't apply for an exemption. And one of the criteria for applying for an exemption for a study is that the study would pose only minimal risk to the participants. So as I pointed out, in the content of my paper, because of the nature of what I would be asking, particularly for the food bank clients who I would be asking about their food insecurity, that could prompt feelings of being embarrassed, of being ashamed, and so that could pose some mental or emotional distress. And so I would have to go through the full training and paperwork. You would have to go through the training either way, but I would have to complete the full application. So, it is useful for you to have a blurb in your paper about IRB, and something really basic like this. I have given the URL for you in this comment bubble so you can get a little bit more information. But because we didn't really discuss this, it's understandable if this doesn't really appear in your document. However, if you're watching this video and you've read the sample paper, then you are aware of it. And again, this isn't something you really need to go and do a lot of research on. Just saying basically that you would go through the Institutional Review Board training and paperwork because your project involved working with human participants. Something along those lines is sufficient. Now, after this paragraph, what I do is I then go from, okay, I would seek approval for my project, into, once I had that approval, this would be my next step. So my next step would then be soliciting participation, because you aren't supposed to solicit participation before you have received clearance for your project. So I would begin soliciting participation, and I would be focusing on the staff at the food bank first, because of course logistically that just makes sense that I would go through the food bank, and then I would, after collecting data from the staff, I would then try and collect data from the food bank clients. Now, I identified the person that I would contact to make sort of my initial contact with to seek permission or participation in the project, and I explained why I would choose this person. Being the faculty sponsor for the food bank, he of course would be the person that I would go to. In asking for his participation, I would need to explain my project. I would need to explain why it is I'm doing the project, and then what the project would entail. and specifically what I would be asking him to do. And then I also indicate that I would ask him for recommendations regarding other staff that I may want to recruit. And this can be a really useful tool whenever you're trying to solicit participation and you don't really have an inside connection to the various people that you would want to participate. Then it can be a good idea if you can recruit someone who's in a more authoritative position to try and give you recommendations for others. That can be really helpful for getting the participation that you need, and so that's why I indicate here that's what I would do. Now in this part, what I'm doing is I'm explaining that for my participants, in terms of the food bank staff, I would want to recruit both faculty and student volunteers. And what I'm doing in these two sentences here is I'm justifying that decision. I'm explaining why it is I would want to involve student volunteers and not just focus on the faculty. So again, make sure that you are justifying your research design decisions any place where a critical reader may question why it is that you would do what you're proposing to do, or you feel like it would be useful to just give a little bit more information. And because the more people that you collect data from, the longer the research process is, and the goal of this paper is you're trying to get funding, I think it's valuable whenever you're proposing to do something like this where you're adding another layer to your data collection. I think it's useful to justify that decision and make it clear to the reader, okay, I know that this is going to prolong my project, which may mean more money ultimately. Obviously for the small scale I wouldn't be trying to secure funding, but for the large scale I would, and the large scale is dependent on the small scale. So I think that it's useful to explain and justify why I may prolong my study by involving even more people. Now in the next paragraph, what I do is I start to get to some of the logistics of the interviews. I explain, again, I mentioned it's semi-structured interviews. I explain how long I would anticipate each interview to take, and then I explain that I would anticipate only one interview. So again, I'm trying to be specific and detailed here. Here, this is information just about where I would intend to conduct the interviews, and then finally, this sentence says how many people it is I would want to interview. And in some cases for your project, you may be able to give an exact number because here are the specific people I'd want to talk to because they have a certain level of expertise, or they're the only people really in the area who would be available and able to answer my questions. However, in other cases, you may have to just give an estimate. And so this seems to be a fairly reasonable estimate given that I would be trying to recruit both faculty and student volunteers who work at the food bank. 5 to 10 seems reasonable within this. Now here in this section, what I do is I discuss the topics of the questions I would ask during the interview rather than listing my interview questions. And instead of listing my interview questions out, I refer the reader to Appendix A. And I'm just going to jump you over to that so you can see Appendix A. Okay, so remember the appendix, as I had mentioned to you in an earlier video and in a comment bubble much earlier in this paper, that the appendix will appear after the references page. So that's why I'm starting you on the references page rather than going straight to the appendix. So because I have multiple appendices in this paper, I do have to label the appendix. I can't just leave it appendix. So this is Appendix A. Notice that below the title Appendix A, I then have a descriptor to indicate what is included in this appendix. So I know as a reader that this appendix will give the semi-structured interview questions that I would pose to the food bank staff. Then I have just this sentence, right, just set up that these are the questions that would be included in the interview. And then I have my questions, how I would intend to phrase them. Now you can see here that there are 17 questions that I would intend to ask in the interview. If I were to try and embed all of these questions earlier in the paper in the small scale research section, then that's really going to negatively affect the organization, right? Because I would have a page and a half or so of just this bulleted list, and that really just isn't going to look that great in the paper, and also I'm having to make my reader get through a page and a half of content before they get back to really what it is I'm wanting to say. So There's no real rule of thumb here in terms of when you should use an appendix or put questions in the paper. I think the best idea is just, if you only have a few questions, if you're proposing a survey or an interview for your research, if you only have a few questions, then you probably can embed them in the small scale section and or in the large scale section. It's not going to affect the organization negatively, and you could bullet it or you could put it in paragraph form. If, however, you have a lot of questions, then it's probably better to move them out into an appendix and then just identify the topics of the question.